tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So continuing with the New Year Dharma Life Reset theme, we talked about sleep for a couple weeks and began talking about food last week. And in last week's talk, talking about food, I was talking about food choices and food timing and some basics around how we might think about eating and come more face to face with some of the hindrances that may have gathered in us around eating, some of the harmful patterns and habits, and just use our eating as a place of practice, right? If in a way the heart of practice is to make the unconscious conscious, this thing that many of us do many times a day can be a place of much unconsciousness. And so to use our mindfulness, our loving kindness, our curiosity, our investigation, just to bring those patterns to light more. And so as we were talking about it last week, and I was giving the talk, I did something that I noticed that I've regularly done, which is I mentioned that I eat vegetarian, and that I have done so for a long time, since my early 20s. It's been, 30 some years now. And I've grown, I've habituated in a way that I don't really like, saying so with a kind of bashfulness almost. And so I didn't like that. What I often do is I'll say that I do it, but I'll try to make it very clear that I'm not, prescribing that anyone else do it. And afterward, I just reflected that was kind of funny, because it's kind of my whole job here to prescribe that we do things. And I prescribe that y'all do all sorts of stuff. Sometimes things that are quite uncomfortable in the way of practice and clarifying the heart and mind. But this is one that has become so deeply politicized and deeply interwoven with identity in many of the communities that are around me anyway, that that it inspires, like it's the kind of thing that inspires unkind words among friends, and harsh responses on Facebook posts that things like this. And so I think in a funny way I've become afraid of the issue. And so of course so now I have to do the thing that responds to that, which is I can't just live with that. So now I'm going to actually just give the talk that I thought I wasn't going to give. So here's my apologia, to be very classical about it, of being vegetarian. And I'll say right off that, the thing that, the landscape that I'm giving this in has changed quite a bit since I started my Dharma practice and started eating in this way, which happened at the same time, in the early 1990s. When I began my practice, the progressive culture in Northern California that I was in and that I encountered in Buddhist centers still essentially thought of virtuous eating in a kind of 1970s vegetarian macrobiotic model. Whole grains, lots of beans, lots of vegetables, fermentation, and chew your food a lot. And that was essentially it. And there was the mainstream standard American diet, sad, and it is. And then there was this. And if you were virtuous, you were this. And you were, a Birkenstock wearing, brown rice eating hippie, which I was. uh, I stopped eating the Birkenstocks. No, wait, sorry, that came out too fast. I never ate the Birkenstocks. I stopped wearing the Birkenstocks when some anarchist skinheads that I knew from Germany, the punks, were like, oh, oh my God, you hippies, I don't know what you're doing. We would never wear Birkenstocks. Those guys are Nazis. And I was like, oh, right. All right, I'm off the Birkenstocks. So, which sort of, points to the sub-theme of this whole talk, which is the quality that the Buddha called superiority conceit. And this is one of the last so-called fetters, right? Things that will bind you to existence and misery. It's one of the last things to go as you approach full awakening or arahantship. Conceit for the Buddha is the view that compares yourself to others. And there's superiority conceit, the idea that you're better than others. There's inferiority conceit, the idea that you're worse than others. And there's equality conceit, the idea that you're the same as others. And they're all wrong view. They all commit an error of understanding because they solidify self and other into positions that become oppositional, even if you're deciding that you're equal in some way. It's a narrative. There's no actual thing happening there other than judgment that solidifies an identity and puts it in opposition to another identity. So all of these kinds of conceit are considered wrong view. What happens in the conversation, the cultural conversation around how we eat, is first of all that all of these kinds of conceit come forward very strongly, and particularly that superiority conceit comes forward. And really in a way they all do. So when I started to eat vegetarian, and I'm going to mostly try to say I eat vegetarian, like it's an eating choice, not I am vegetarian, like an identity. And it's awkward because that's part of what is so troublesome about this topic is that it's become an identity category rather than something else. Like I just eat what I like to eat, Given the choice of restaurants, I will virtually always choose Thai, and I essentially live on green curry. So am I a curryista? I practice curryism. My kid also practices curryism, which is to say, the religion of Wardell Stephen Curry, and the master of the 3-point shot. So when I began, practicing in this way, it was the way that folks were eating in a lot of Dharma centers that I was practicing at, and the first education that I encountered around healthy eating was from the macrobiotic perspective, was books from the Japanese pioneers of the macrobiotic movement, nice dog-eared things from the 70s that were still around. And I learned to cook from those books, and I love that. And I started to just love that style of eating. And so, so I began to just eat what I wanted to eat, and it happened to be that. And and the meat fell away from my diet, and dairy and eggs at other times have fluctuated in the diet. And I'll say something about sort of vegetarian and vegan-ness a bit later. So for a long time in my 20s, when this began, most of my friends primarily ate vegetarian, and then in the late 90s, this diet called Atkins appeared, and following it, a whole bunch of different things with various names, and really peaking with a thing that called itself Paleo. And all of these diets had in common a reevaluation of the role of grain in the diet, and a celebration, a re-celebration of meat, and or nutritionally dense foods, as they'll come to be called. And bit by bit, the vast majority, in my communities anyway, of my vegetarian eating friends switched to these new meat-centered diets. And very often they did so with the zeal of converts. And so suddenly I was the only vegetarian at the party, and I was being made fun of and teased. And I got and people would start to make jokes about how everything at their dinner party had meat in it, including the chocolate, because there was this apparently very lovely hipster chocolate bar at one point that had bacon bits in it. But then it became the norm in my Buddhist community as well. And so for a while I was very confused by this, and then I let it go. But it continues to be the case that there's in my community, there's not a lot of vegetarians around, except that somewhat culturally adjacent to where I sit, and a little bit more in the urban, kind of in the urban millennial scene, there's a very strong and very fierce vegan activist movement. So in a way, the movement has broadened, and the most vocal people around now, often around food choice, are people taking non-mainstream views in a couple of different places. A non-mainstream view that centers meat in a very intense way, a non-mainstream view that centers absolutely denying meat and dairy and eggs in a very intense way, in the sort of vegan activist way. And there's often fierce views expressed on both sides. And so I want to say a little bit about some Dharma reflections on the vegetarian diet. I just want to nod to the cultural complexity, and then I'll say a little bit about this isn't really going to be about like why I make my choices. I can tell you easily why I make my choices, but I'll give a little bit of background, I think. So people sometimes are surprised that the Buddha did not teach his followers to be vegetarian. He didn't make it. It was not one of the rules. So here's the basics of that. Food choice of any kind, including whether to eat meat or not, is not part of the monastic rules, because the monastics, and I'm speaking here to the descriptions in the Pali Canon and the Vinaya, so the northern traditions, the Chinese and Japanese and Korean traditions, and the Himalayan traditions, Tibetan, etc., they made different choices eventually, and the Mahāyāna made different choices in multiple directions, both to not worry about storing food, cooking food, and how food was made. So monks began to store and cook and own food and grow food, none of which is in the Vinaya, right? Southern monks don't do that. But also parts of the Chinese lay Buddhist community took up vegetarianism very strongly as an ethical principle, but that's also not in the early texts. So I'm going to speak to what's in the Pali Canon, our sense of what the Buddha originally taught, as preserved in the Pali Canon and the Chinese Agamas. There's no rule to be vegetarian because the monastics cannot till the land, cannot store food overnight, and have to go begging every single day and receive whatever the lay people give them. And so if your primary practice is to receive whatever is offered, it doesn't really work if you're making demands about what that is. If you go to a poor family and you say, I only eat vegetarian, in many parts of Southeast Asia, for instance, that's more expensive than eating meat. And anyway, you're asking people not just to give of their own generosity to support you, but you're actually being picky. And so monastics cannot ask for anything specific. And for lay people, the Buddha did not prescribe it. He could have, but he didn't. What he did do, however, is, as you know, the first precept that lay people take is the precept against killing, right? So to not take life. So this is a precept. So if killing is what's necessary to do in order for you to eat meat or meat products, then to do so would be to break a precept. How this works in practice in some Buddhist communities in South and Southeast Asia is that the killing is outsourced. So, but some Buddhists will buy meat from, a Muslim or like a Muslim butcher, for instance. Some Hindu groups are fully vegetarian, famously the Brahmin caste. Many are vegetarian, but they will outsource the killing of meat to other castes. Buddhists will buy meat from folks observing other traditions. In the monastic tradition, the guideline was given that monks should not accept meat if it was killed specifically for them. So this is like, you don't want to take on the karma of that killing. But if a family, for instance, has meat and they're sharing part of it with you, but it's their food, it was not killed specifically for you, then that's all right. So there's a bunch of sort of legalistic details in the Vinaya about this, but that's the gist, essentially. Don't kill. For monastics, of course don't kill, but also don't accept meat that was killed specifically for you. And the lay people know that, so you don't kill a chicken and then offer it to the monks saying, we killed this chicken just for you. You say this is part of our family dinner and we're sharing it with you. And then for lay people, you're in the mysterious gray area of being enjoined not to kill, but not specifically what you should eat or not eat. So many folks, including myself, think that that's fairly direct instructions, and that I prefer neither to kill nor to ask others to kill on my behalf. And so, for this reason, I don't eat meat. It's one of the reasons, actually. Different Buddhist traditions have interpreted this structure differently, and I'm going to keep hinting toward watching out for superiority conceit, because you might already feel like you're better or worse than some characters in this story. When I was a monk in Burma for a brief time, first of all, when I was first in Buddhist practice, I was with a very fierce Japanese Zen teacher who teased his monks and lay students mercilessly for their attention to health. And he says, I lived to, when I heard him say this, he was 88, but he lived to be 106 in the end. He said, I lived to be this old on white bread, white sugar, and whiskey. So you guys shut up. There were at various times some monks who wanted, to get a little more macro on the eating style at the monastery. And he was like, you're attached. But when I went to Burma to be a Theravada monk, I found myself in a monastery. There are vegetarian monasteries there, by the way. The Paok monastic system is vegetarian. Respect. But I was in a system. I was at Sayadaw U Janaka's place in the Mahasi system. And it was not a wealthy monastery. And the vast majority of the monks and nuns ate meat. And so I got there, and before I was a monk, when I was still in lay clothes, I tried to stay vegetarian, but that meant that all I had to eat was rice and boiled cabbage and this marvelous chili paste, until somebody told me that it was ground up dried shrimp and chilies. But the main dish was this dark, oily stewed meat at every single meal, and I absolutely didn't want to eat it. And then after I was a monk, I said, okay, I'm going to practice with this, and I have to eat and be nourished. But somebody found out that I was trying to be vegetarian, and they said, oh, and then they put me on the special vegetarian table, which I didn't know existed. There was one little table off to the side up in the front, and 6 of us got special vegetarian dishes. And I this was wonderful. The food was excellent. But then I realized that, first of all, it was very expensive. So buying that food cost a lot more than the meat, and it was much fancier, actually. So it was kind of like the special table. And then I was really mixed about being there, like 6 of us are eating this marvelous range of vegetable dishes, and the 180 some monastics, 2/3 women, 2/3 nuns, 1/3 monks, almost all were eating just the oily stewed meat as their primary food. And when the other American that was there and we wanted to sponsor a meal for the monastery, to buy a meal for the whole thing, which is about $100 for one meal for the day. I said, oh, could we make it a vegetarian meal? And they said, oh, you want to buy a vegetarian meal? That's like twice as much, right? It was a huge amount of additional expense. And so, economics and poverty and culture all folding together to create the complexity that was there. The last thing I'll say about being a monk there is that, and about superiority conceit, is that one of the most challenging of the well over 100 monastic rules I was expected to follow, most of them don't amount to much in your day-to-day life. But there was one that always stuck with me, which was that it is a minor offense to look into another monk's bowl with the intent to judge. So to look onto to someone else's plate to judge what they're eating is an offense. So watch out for your judgment. So over the years, I had different reasons in myself for being vegetarian. Honestly, when I first started doing it, it's just the food I preferred. I had grown up eating a ton of meat as a child and through my teenage years, and I kind of just fell out of liking for it. And I really liked how the vegetarian food that I was eating, again, mostly macro, I liked how it tasted, I liked how I felt, I liked cooking it. It felt good. Later on, I felt like, the ethics of the first precept were core, that I didn't want to contribute to the death of beings in this way. And I want to pause for a moment with that. That's the primary reason that most folks in the Dharma lean toward being vegetarian is, okay, I've taken this first precept, the precept to not kill. It's clear that if I'm eating meat, somebody's doing the killing, whether it's me or someone else. So I choose to not take the life of these animals. So this is an ancient debate in Buddhism, as you might obviously know. But there's been different solutions to it. So like in Tibet, one of the, this has been a debate for a very long time. And one of the debates goes a little bit like this. What's happening when you take a life, right? You interrupt the karmic stream of a being, a sentient being who's on a path that could lead toward liberation. You interrupt that life that's happening now in a very violent way. And that makes it hard for them to accrue the good karma, to do the good actions, to have the positive states that would cause them to have a better rebirth in their next life and eventually proceed on the path toward practicing the Dharma and becoming liberated. So to kill a being in this way impedes their progress toward liberation because their death is violent in this way rather than peaceful. They have less of a chance to develop beautiful states of mind. And so if that's the case, then, and this is coming from Tibet, where eating vegetarian is very difficult, then they said, well, if we want to minimize the suffering, then at least it's a better thing to kill one very large animal than many small ones. So for instance, killing one ox to feed, many, many dozens of people would be preferable to killing many dozens of chickens for instance, or fish, because each one of these is an individual sentient life. So this is one of the classical arguments, against this. In the South Asian context, I'll speak a little bit about sort of vegetarian versus vegan distinction here. In the South Asian context, classical Indian-style vegetarian diets include, a lot of milk and yogurt, and but modern diets that include dairy have to reckon with all of the deaths that come in the dairy industry, right? The way that male dairy animals are killed, the way that calves are separated from mothers, often killed, the way that the milk giving process is hacked, often in violent ways. Right? We have to contend with this if you're going to eat kind of the classic South Asian vegetarian type diet. And so all of this comes into play. And part of what becomes necessary and challenging for a lot of folks to wrestle with is, if our core motive in limiting or eliminating meat eating or dairy eating or animal products across the board is ethical, not wanting to cause harm, first of all, we want to think about what we mean by cause harm. Like, does that Tibetan argument make sense to us? Is it better for me to kill one cow over the course of my year or lots and lots of chickens? And it's not useful to say, like, no, it's obviously better to kill none. Like, sure, that's true. But this is for every practitioner to figure out. And it's more important to wrestle with it than to just be told what the absolute right thing is. Because, like, for these Tibetans, there's not actually a place for the more renunciate tactic, although there in a certain way is. And so that's the thing I want to get onto next, is really what it means to take on renunciation as the core, where renunciation is actually a different practice than ethics. They're related, but they're not exactly the same. So for the ethical argument, what we want to attend to is that we're thinking about, our actions and the consequences of our actions, and that throughout our life, our actions have impacts on others, right? Because we live in a relational field. And, this is one of those places where no matter how we eat, our actions have an impact. We want to be not in denial about that impact. So one more piece about that, another argument that has come up in modern times, right? Because our modern, agricultural and livestock practices are radically different from that of ancient or even recently modern South Asia, recent pre-modern South Asia. For many folks now, the meat that they get, but also the dairy that they get, the animal products of many kinds that they find, are neither local nor immediate. They have a intense ecosystem impact. And so another way to think about ethics, kind of taking that Tibetan model, would it be better to kill one cow or 100 chickens? Taking that further, we could say, what happens if we reflect on the impact of our actions on the broader ecosystem in a more comprehensive way? And so one of the ways that argument goes in modern times is to think about the whole footprint of our eating. And so to think about, like, the dialectic between eating local and flying things in. So one argument that complicates the pure ethics of, for instance, eating vegan, right, abstaining from all animal products entirely, is that for many folks to be healthy on such a diet, they need or feel that they need, and that's a place for everyone to investigate for themselves, sources of protein or strong nutrition or fats beyond that immediately accessible from starchy plants, from roots and grains and leaves. And so folks will find themselves, for instance, eating a lot of tree nuts, or eating, a lot of avocados, or eating a lot of coconut oil, something like that. All of these are things that I see in the community around me, right? And so not to weigh against each other, but to really put in the mix. And I've been in conversations where people are really trying to very sincerely, wrestle with this. Like, okay, if I, let's say I cut out dairy because it obviously, causes death and harm to animals and harm to ecosystems through manure and sewage and all of the intense, and using up food crops that could otherwise go to feed people, if you try to pull yourself out from many layers of the livestock ecosystem, then, I've been around folks reckoning with like, okay, so then do I have a diet that depends on, flying in tropical nuts, or supporting the California almond industry, which is almost decimated by, water use and the challenges of like, how do we make that many nuts, or how do we fly in that many avocados from Mexico or wherever? And you want to include everything. And so then there's a whole movement of saying, actually, if we want to get away from, oil usage in the production of our food, we want to go radically local, right? So this is a different direction on the ethical front. So I have a friend who is an urban farmer and gardener, and she wants to eat meat, but she does not want to support industrial either agriculture or livestock practices. And so she raises rabbits herself. She's done her research. She says, extremely low ecosystem impact. She kills them herself, so she raises backyard rabbits. And so for her ethic, which is less about the individual beings and more about the broad ecosystem impact environmentally, for her, that's a choice that makes sense. And so what I want to propose then is that the thing that the teachings on not taking life force us into, if we really take them seriously, is to reckon with how our very existence impacts the lives of others, and that the choices we make impact the lives of others, and that we want to become more conscious rather than less, right? We want to bring consciousness to our habitual patterns. And so this is a place where there are a lot of opinions and there's a lot of superiority conceit around what's, right or best to do. And that's, I think, partly beautiful, because this is one of the places where our actions have such an impact on others. And it's partly not useful, because it can have the impact of actually shutting down inquiry rather than encouraging it. And so I encourage you, I was talking about this with one of my friends, an artist friend of mine, and because I posted about it in my newsletter yesterday, and so he wrote me back saying, "Oh yeah, I'm mostly vegetarian. This is what I do." And he said, he said, I eat. I use this phrase. So many of you will know that the journalist and writer about many interesting things, Michael Pollan, wrote a book about food choices, and his slogan was "Eat food," meaning actual food and not processed chemical stuff. So eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And he said that he got the most grief about mostly plants because his vegan activist friends took him to town on that, but that he stood by it, and as good advice for most people. And my friend Keith said, yeah, what I say is, and he said that he made it clear to qualify that he uses this particular term, coming out of its use in gay radical culture. He said, what I say is eat food, not too much, mostly plants, and don't be a bitch about it. So that's his, side note on that. So we have to reckon with the impacts of our actions. That's basic karma. And I want to go then one sort of parallel step forward, or bring in one other thread then. So there's the ethics piece, right? How do we keep the first precept? How do we practice with that? Over the years, as my friends and community, almost entirely went back to eating meat, and almost entirely draw upon health-related justification for doing so. The vast majority of people that they say, this feels better for my health. I prefer this for my health. And so I don't criticize what people say about their own health, right? If that's what either feels right or is right, and again, it's not on me to parse. I leave that to each person to determine for themselves. It's challenging when something feels, like this is what seems to, feel best for me, but I don't like it. I've known folks to really wrestle with that, and I want to bow to their sincerity in doing that. I happen to be someone who both feels healthy on my vegetarian diet and likes it, and I feel very fortunate in that. I've known folks who are like, I don't like eating this way, but I seem to really need it for my health. And again, I don't, I'm not going to tell somebody they're wrong, right? I think our practice is just to investigate. But it might well be, for instance, that I would be, stronger in various ways. This is part of the proposal of the meat-loving crowd right now, if I ate more animal protein. And so then I want to bring in one further piece, which is actually that I'm not eating vegetarian for my health, and I'm not even completely eating it for the ethical reasons. I very much like the ethical reasons, but also that there's an aspect in it of renunciation that is not just about the ethical, but interweaves the ethical. If the heart of liberation in the Buddhist system is to no longer be reborn, because our intention to not experience or cause suffering has taken us to the point of no longer being willing to grasp at any state of mind that gives rise to dukkha, to suffering, then part of our practice can be to try to let go of those actions that condition future birth, that condition more revolving around the wheel of samsara. And so in choosing not to eat meat, I feel like part of how I interpret that, and this isn't prescriptive, I don't know if anyone else needs to do this, but this is how I interpret this for myself. And again, I'm saying it that way because this is not in the texts, this is how I feel it. I feel like when I practice in this way and try to minimize the harm that I cause in the world in all sorts of ways, what I'm doing is trying to set up the conditions for less karma to follow me into the next birth. And I'm trying to set up the conditions for the kind of deep letting go that the descriptions of awakening to me clearly point to. And I have felt, and again, I've felt privileged that I like my vegetarian diet and I feel happy and comfortable on it and strong and all of that. But I have also felt like even if it is the case, even if the progressive Northern California meat lobby is correct, who knows? But like, even if it's the case that I would be stronger or more energetic or whatever, on some more meat, I'm willing to take the hit. And again, that's a privileged stance, so that's not for everybody. But I feel like I love actually just letting go of doing that thing, right? And so there can be, one of the responses to the health argument can be something like, I acknowledge that and I'm willing to do something else for myself, and I want to do this other thing. I want to let go of this thing. And so I'm just not going to do it. And so what I want to close with here, knowing that this is so contentious, right, is just the encouragement that that we bring our practice of the intention for well-being, the intention for other beings to be well, for ourselves to be well, and our discernment about the sources of our own feelings and choices, that we bring that part of our practice into our eating. So that we notice, where do my choices come from, right? What am I holding on to, right? Do I have fixations in my mind about what's right and wrong, or about what's healthy or not healthy, or what's, evil? Or do I just have habits? Do I have cultural habits? This is just how my people do it, and I'm from this place or that place. Or just, I've been sleepwalking for a lot of years and eating whatever, is comfortable and right in front of me. And that our practice really is just to shine light on any of those views. Because what this is going to really come down to, if it's going to be liberating, is the letting go of fixed views. And so like monastics who receive whatever's offered, we can eat a variety of diets, but when the views become fixated, there will be suffering. And when diets that cause the deaths and harm of other beings, but also just of the ecosystem, become habituated and unconscious, that harm is likely to continue. And so we lean both into our intention to not cause harm and our intention to wake up to unconscious habits. And between the two, I think there can be enough momentum to at least shake up the habits that we may have inherited or accrued around our eating. And when we do that, some folks, when they do that and do that sincerely over time, will find that they are drawn to diets that cause less harm in a number of ways. And so I encourage us in that direction. All right, so I'll pause there. Thank you for warmly listening and reflecting. Yeah, good luck out there in the kitchens and markets of the world. Hi, blessings in your practice. Thanks for watching. If these resources are supportive for your meditation and your practice, liking and subscribing helps the channel. And there are links in the description below to donate to support the Sangha and my own teaching. And you're welcome to come and join the Tuesday night gathering, which is on donation and open to all. And you can find information for that on the website. So blessings in your practice. Take care.